people remember that Nazi Germany was a country that was ruled by laws, but there was no rule of law. The Soviet Union was a country that was ruled by law, but there was no rule of law. So it's one of those things that it isn't always easy to define. Mr. Justice Douglas of the U.S. Supreme Court, when he was referring to pornography, he said he couldn't define it, but he knew it when he saw it. Mr. Justice Kennedy made a similar statement about the rule of law. He essentially said, I can't really tell you what it is in all of its context, but I know it when I see it. So I would encourage all of you, particularly our young law students who are here, try to understand what the rule of law is, get to know it as best you can, and encourage your government and all governments, all lawyers everywhere, to make sure that we are nurturing and supporting the rule of law. And I think that's probably, at least in my opinion and the opinion of many people, one of the best ways to assure that there is going to be economic growth in those jurisdictions that adhere to it. And at this point, I thank you very much for your time and your attention. I think we all realize that we're the only thing standing between you and the end of the day here, and in some cases, a drink. And I will turn it over to Arun.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's when you are addressing a half-filled hall, it's both discouraging and encouraging. It's discouraging because you feel not many people are interested in listening to you, but it's encouraging that there are dedicated people who are definitely interested in listening to you. So I'm thankful to everyone sitting here and listening to my useless comments maybe. I'm indeed honored to be present here, and I must compliment Mr. Kaviraj for organizing this wonderful conference. Let me introduce myself. I'm Arun Chawla, Assistant Secretary General from FICCI, the Apex Chamber of Commerce and Industry in India. This topic, legal challenges to rapid economic growth, is a very interesting one, and it can be covered generically, it can be covered with respect to a specific jurisdiction. And I think, being a man from the chamber, I'm interested in speaking about the Indian economy as such. I would say that we all know that India has had a wonderful time in terms of growth, a remarkable rate of growth even during the financial meltdown in the world. And the growth rate has now plummeted to around 5%. The credit rating has gone down. The rupee has hit an all-time low against the US dollar. All this has had a ripple effect on the economy. The general view that one would take for this kind of sluggishness of the Indian economy would be that this can be attributed to large-scale corruption, while others would call it, blame it on the government inaction, or what they say, policy paralysis. But let me highlight something, ladies and gentlemen, that corruption is an age-old issue. Examples abound of many jurisdictions, Indonesia, BRICS nations, which have shown excellent growth rates in spite of being ranked very low on the Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index. Likewise, policy inaction is best restricted to certain sectors, particularly the infrastructure sector, which may keep the market sentiment low, but definitely it cannot obstruct growth. So if corruption and policy paralysis are not the real impediments, what are the factors that inhibit growth and slow down the wheels of economy? it is here that I would very categorically say that there is an empirical relationship between the legal framework of the country and the quality of economic growth that it can have. If the legal framework is efficient, it will stimulate the economy. If it is less efficient, it will constrict the market. Many of the issues have been covered by Mr. Duffy in his address, generic issues of what actually the legal framework should constitute. I will be very specific to India. Therefore, one of the most important underlying reasons that I find for the low economic growth in India is the unpredictability and the uncertainty in the institutional and legal framework. Uncertainty is a product of ad hoc approach to issues rather than a well thought out policy and poor implementation of rules. The retrospective amendment of tax issues following the dispute with Vodafone has given rise to uncertainty and concern among foreign investors and governments. Similarly, the issue of auction and bidding of competitive bidding has been under consideration for allocation of captive coal blocks since 2004. Uncertainty is therefore absolutely antithetical to the rule of law and can have a detrimental impact on business. A fluid legal framework leaves unreasonable discretion in the hands of individuals, which more often than not are exercised arbitrarily. The 2G case best demonstrates the wrinkles in the policy framework. The uncertainty rattled the market, the telecom operators, and the leaders alike. Uncertainty is therefore one area which needs to be surmounted and which can be best addressed through streamlining of procedures. Procedural fairness and certainty will go a long way in decongesting the path of growth. A concomitant factor to the issue of simplified procedures is the issue of speedy implementation of the decisions and approvals granted under the law. Clear procedures, but which are implemented at a slow pace, can be burdensome to business and can defeat the very purpose of the business activity. Coming to a more direct approach, I will be emphatic in saying that entrepreneurial activity serves as an engine of growth. It is important in empowering the poor, enhancing production, and providing an impetus to innovation. Enterprise development in India is beset with critical challenges. If the challenges remain unresolved, gaps in enterprise development have the potential to thwart the country's competitiveness and ability to effectively function within the global production networks. Rule of law, as Mr. Duffy very rightly pointed out, is something which needs to be emphasized on. It encompasses regulatory structures, policy environment, and enforcement of regulations. Let me come back to the World Bank's latest report for 2014 on India, doing business survey in India. It ranks India 134th of the 189 economies with regard to ease of doing business. The country also sits at the bottom in all other enterprise development indicators, such as starting a business, dealing with construction permits, registering property, and so many others, enforcing contracts, etc., etc. Thank you. Take the instance of starting a business. When entrepreneurs draw up a business plan and try to get underway, the first hurdle they face is complying with the procedures required to incorporate and register the entity. In India, it takes 12 procedures and nothing less than 27 days just to register an entity. Another important dimension is access to financing. While there may be specific laws mandating financing for enterprises, particularly the medium and the small scale, obtaining funds is a different story altogether. Most lending institutions require collaterals which are accompanied by tedious documentation and other technical requirements, which is very difficult to meet. India's existing labor regulations, we all know, is the most restrictive and complex in the world. Protects only the insiders and a handful of those employed in the organized sector. Let me now move to another related area, and which is of judicial overreach and how this impacts the business environment. An important macroeconomic development in the country that got a lot of attention recently is the current account deficit. Current account deficit had widened so much that it became a top priority for the government. Now, one of the factors which led to current account deficit was lowering of exports. You all know that India is a large exporter of iron ore to China. However, due to certain adverse developments, the Supreme Court restricted mining in areas such as Karnataka and Goa and put a blanket ban on mining. Although the Supreme Court has lifted the mining in certain select locations, what this order has done was not just to reduce the supply of iron ore for the domestic steel industry, but also cut down our exports in a dramatic manner. I remember reading an editorial where the leading financial paper said the Supreme Court is responsible for the current account deficit. We also have the case when earlier this year, the Supreme Court accepted a petition and agreed to examine the drug pricing policy. Specifically, the Supreme Court agreed to examine the National Pharmaceutical Pricing Policy 2012 for fixing prices of essential medicines in the country. While the Supreme Court may be within its rights to do that, you can well imagine that just like in the case of iron ore, examining of policies fixed by the executive and which is latter's prerogative, the business environment in the country, and for those particular sectors becomes so uncertain that this leads to lowering of confidence, investments, and growth. While on the one hand we are talking about judicial overreach, the other side of the coin is the inefficiencies in the judicial system itself, court congestion, outdated laws, legal costs. These are the most often problems which business complains of. Lack of judges, outdated laws, inadequate infrastructure all inhibit trade, commerce, and other forms of activity. A balanced, swift, affordable, and fair justice delivery system, besides promoting law and order, aids in the development of markets, investment, including foreign direct investment, and affects economic growth positively. So friends, to conclude, the challenges for a country like India, the legal challenges, is to accelerate the legal and judicial reforms, which can unleash the spirit of entrepreneurship and which in turn can lead to the rapid growth of economy, making it the basis of lasting social order. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Devdas Balika, and I'm the General Counsel for Coca-Cola India and Southwest Asia. I'm also its ethics officer. Well, this topic is, yes, I think as one of the speakers mentioned, it can be as general or as specific as one can make it. But I would like to share some specific instances of my experience working in the corporate sector. Now, as far as India is concerned, the year 1990, 91, that's the year considered the watershed year for liberalization, for India getting integrated with the world economy. And, I think what's really happened is, I can think of a parallel with a very obese person, going on a diet. And, when you go on a diet as a very obese person, you tend to lose a lot of weight in the initial, first few weeks or month. and then it sort of tapers off, and then losing weight becomes very difficult. So I think the journey that India as an economy has had is somewhat similar to a very obese person. We've had some quick gains at the outset in the beginning few years, but I think as time passes by, we realize that this system, this economy needs a lot of changes, and those are the changes that are not easy, they are not simple, and those solutions need to be found. There's a lot of work, and it doesn't get you quick returns the way we got returns in the initial few years of the liberalization phase. So what is it that we're talking about here? I think everybody seems to agree that legal reforms are paramount and they are the need of the hour. Perhaps we could have embarked on the journey of legal reforms when we started liberalization. So there's obviously a lot of gloom and doom scenario in the last few years, last couple of years to be more precise. But surveys can be misleading. I think one has to still look at fundamentals of the economy. And I think the sentiment is still there. People do, investors, the international community does still believe that India is worth a destination for investment. And I think very recently, a couple of days back, one of the large consultancies have published a report saying that India is still the most attractive destination just after, and it seems Brazil and China follow behind. But there are many challenges. And in fact, very recently in September, the Ministry of Corporate Affairs issued a report, and it's the report of the Committee for Reforming the Regulatory Environment for Doing Business in India. And I think it's a very interesting document because it takes a hard, frank look at all the challenges that are there today for the economy and particularly in the regulatory environment. So, in fact, one of the important things is the remark that it makes that, it's in India, doing business is like an obstacle race, except that in normal obstacle races, you know what the obstacles are, you know how many obstacles there are, and you know the locations of those obstacles. But